What I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today is some of the work we're doing in terms of the sources and measurements of stress in kids with chromosome 22q deletion syndrome. And really this is actually less of a data-driven discussion, more about an opportunity to give you guys the language to think about the term stress and anxiety. I mean, these things are sort of thrown around. We kind of have a general idea what they mean. Like everybody kind of thinks of them as the same thing, but really they're a little bit different. Okay, and I want to sort of get you to a point where you can sort of conceptualize these ideas and what we'd say in the scientific field, operationally define them. Say this is what stress is and this is what anxiety is. Not saying that we've done that completely yet, but just to give you an idea as consumers. Okay. Okay, so what is stress? And the classic idea of stress is a shift from homeostasis. Homeostasis meaning balance. And I'm going to show you a slide, kind of a classic slide looking at a thermostat to kind of drive home this point, okay? The other way to think about it, it can be any psychophysiological consequence of change or dealing of a change, all right? So if you think about it, you may be getting hungry, right? So you feel, I feel kind of hungry and I'm kind of motivated to get some food. Not such a big deal, but if there's a motivational state there, okay? But boy, if you don't eat for a week, that becomes quite potent, powerful stimulus, doesn't it? So the idea is that stress is a continuum. It's not an on-off situation, okay? So it's a continuum. And you can think of it as this sort of emotional state that combines a cognitive and emotional response of the mind, if you will, with the physiology of the body. Okay, these things are really intertwined. Okay. Okay, and to think about coping, we talk about coping. We're thinking about the ability to effectively adapt to a situation. So situations change. Are you able to successfully adjust either your behavior, your internal state? Okay, we can talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But actually resist the negative aspects of the stressor, if you will. Okay? And what happens, you want to sit there and get to a point where it doesn't become so overwhelming and so overpowering that you're not effectively living your life. Okay? Okay, so just to really kind of get this point home, we talk about the physiology of stress. All right? So I talk about homeostasis, which is balance. So here's a classic image here where you've got a thermostat, a set point, and a sensor. So this is like a thermometer. And you've got an on-off switch. So just like in your home, you're going to turn on your air conditioning, or you're going to turn on your furnace, right, for hot or cold. So there's a set point, and the temperature of the room says maybe it's a little warm in here, right, when we first started. And so there's a detector in there to say how warm it is. And then after a certain threshold, maybe where it starts to get a little uncomfortable, a switch clicks on, and either your air conditioner or your furnace turns on to actually change that environment in the room. Okay? And it's exactly the same as your body. So if you get really hot, what do? You may drink water, you may take off your sweater, you may move from a hot environment to a cold environment. Okay? You may just say to yourself in a mental capacity, say, wow, it's really hot in here, but I got to really focus on what I'm doing. I'm just going to try to ignore those bodily sensations. Right? So you can see how there can be a physiological and a mental aspect to these things. Okay? And so keep this in mind. We're going to come back to this in a minute. Okay? So now I want to sort of separate anxiety and stress per se. Okay? So you could have a stress situation where it's very, very warm and you're very motivated to change your body temperature or move out of that environment. Okay? It's very different than thinking about something that's coming in the future, potentially. Okay, we're going to come back to that. So separate the sort of immediate versus future. And they can actually share a lot of the same symptoms, right? So you have your heart rate, you start thinking about something that's coming in the future that you're concerned about, and your heart rate goes up, and you have a hard time focusing, and you feel anxious, right? It's a kind of classic sense. But it may be very different than the actual source of the anxiety. Okay? So anxiety can be very specific. You can say, boy, how am I going to pay my mortgage? Or boy, I'm worried about this upcoming doctor's appointment. Or boy, I have a talk I have to give today. Boy, that's going to be, how's that going to go? All right? So you can anticipate the future. All right? But the tricky bit about anxiety is that stress and anxiety are different in that you can remove the stressor, for example, change the temperature of the room, and you feel better, right? The temperature has been adjusted, it's now a little cooler in here, and you feel pretty good. Whereas anxiety, even when you remove the stressor, sometimes the anxiety can remain, right? So, boy, I got through this situation, but what's the next one going to be like? What's the next one going to be like? You know, or what's this other this sort of other aspects of anxiety that can become that can stay around even after what appears to be the source of the anxiety is removed. Okay? And it's important to know, too, as I mentioned before, that anxiety can also elicit a physiological response. So when you're anxious about something, your palms can sweat, your heart rate can go up. Okay? So just briefly, what about depression? We're not going to talk about that too much, but depression and anxiety actually share a lot of common aspects, right? For example, you see irritability, difficulty sleeping, trouble concentrating. You see that in folks who have depression. And it's not uncommon for people to be comorbid or have both depression and anxiety. All right? But they're not always the same thing. These, it seems sometimes strange that these could be separate, because if you're really anxious all the time, you go, wow, that must be kind of a depressing situation. All right? But they can be quite different. All right? But there are some ideas, and this is where we talk about the whole lifespan development, from early experience throughout development into adulthood, where the idea that there's uncontrollable sources of stress or uncontrollable sources of anxiety that are unchangeable and unpredictable, then that may, in fact, lead to a depressive state. And you'll see people who say, why bother? I can't cope with these things. So there is a relationship between that, but we can talk about that later. Okay, so Dr. Simon mentioned the idea of allostatic load. So this is kind of a physiological aspect. Okay? So that's sort of my interest in some of the physiological aspects of stress. Okay? And so this idea of allostasis is this state of trying to maintain homeostasis. So imagine, go back to the idea of the thermostat and the room temperature. If the room temperature changes up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down all the time, you have to make adjustments. You got to turn on the AC now, you got to turn on the furnace now. You got to turn on the AC now, you got to turn on the furnace now. Back and forth. And that takes effort and energy, physiological energy or behavioral energy. Okay? So it's actually actively maintaining that balance. Okay? And the idea of allostatic load is the wear and tear on the body that develops through this process of actually trying to do that. So imagine, getting back to the example of the thermostat, you keep switching that on and off, on and off, on and off, on and off, over and over and over and over and over again. You could imagine that switch, the metaphor of that switch, being worn out, right? So you always tell your kids, don't keep turning on the lights on and off, lights on, you're going to burn out the bulb, right? It's really common. So the same idea, it's the wear and tear on the system for change, okay? So here's an example of sort of a typical recovery from stress. So you have activity. So this is a stress response here, this line. Okay? So you have this activity change. So maybe it's the temperature in the room is getting very high. Okay? Or you've got an infection. Right? And so the stress goes up, and there's a physiological response, a change. Right? And then you have this recovery where there's a change back to a homeostatic state or a balanced state. Right? So you apply a stressor, you cope with it, broadly defined, and then it returns back to a normal baseline. Okay? So you can imagine how allostatic load, if you have this happening all the time, so you've got a stressor and response, stress, response, just constant, one thing after another, after another, after another, one hit after another. Okay? And there's a pretty good adaptation here, but it's happening so often that really increases allostatic load. Then you might have this other example. We have a lack of adaptation. We have this repeated stressor over and over and over again. And for the first while, you can adapt to it and you cope well. But after a while, you get worn out. And there's this change where the adaptive response goes down. It's a little hard to see here. Sometimes you might see a stress response where there's a stressor and the coping mechanism doesn't turn off. Right? So you're always on. Okay? And you can imagine that. Imagine you're revving the engine all the time, really, really hard. You can wear that system out. And then sometimes you see this inadequate response where you should have a stress response, right? You really should be able to rally, change that temperature in the room, but it doesn't change, right? You're not actually having the mechanisms that are innate to cope with the stressor just aren't working. Okay? So again, back to the example I was saying, if you wore out the switch, you can imagine that all this different, anywhere on this picture here, you could picture things wearing out, either the switch, or the heater breaks, or the temperature of the room and the heat produced become unregulated, right? Because you have to have all these mechanisms to cope with them. Right? Okay, so what are the things that influence allostatic load? And this is exactly what Dr. Simon was talking about in terms of individual variability and experience and genetics. Okay? So you can picture here, it might be a little hard to see in the back here, but I'll just go through them. Your environmental stressors, so where you work, your home life, your environment, the schools your children attend, right? Major life events, like Dr. Simon was talking about, loss or moves, things like that. Trauma and abuse, right? Trauma can be broadly defined. You can have major surgery as a child. Individual differences is exactly what Dr. Simon was talking about in terms of genes, development, and experience. And then the behavioral responses. This is interesting too, because people don't really think about this. It's reciprocal, isn't it? Right? So imagine if you're really stressed, there's good ways to deal with it. Let's bring it to our own example. So you're really stressed about things. I'm going to go and exercise, and I'm going to meditate, and I'm going to eat really healthy and do these really positive things. Or I'm going to smoke more. I'm going to really use big pizza. You know, I'm going to drink, take drugs. There's lots of positive and negative things, choices people make. Not always choices sometimes, but choices that people make that will add to that problem, right? Meditation, not so bad. You know, bottle of scotch, not so good, okay? And contributes to these things. And then you have this physiological response, right? So the physiological response is the heart rate, the release of hormones in your body that help you deal with the stress in the short term. Okay? And then you can either have adaptation, where you successfully navigate those things. Remember I said you get this adaptive response and you get back down to normal. Or you can have this elevated allostatic load. Okay, so why study stress and anxiety in this population of kids? Okay? Well, anxiety is common. And you're going to hear a lot of data from some of our colleagues today about this. And we know that anxiety predicts adaptive function. There's a handful of studies, not even a handful, a couple of studies that have shown that anxiety is predictive of outcomes later on in life, in combination with a number of other factors, but anxiety was the one factor that was the most important, if you will, right? When you look at onset of psychosis in adulthood, right? And this was a study this was sort of a finding that was in a larger study. They weren't specifically looking at anxiety, okay? Right? So we know this. Certainly a smaller subset of folks, kids with 22q deletion syndrome, are at risk. All right, a smaller subset, but it is higher than the typically developing population. But the thing is, I want you to think about is, just as much as we worry about who may develop schizophrenia, we need to also think about the fact that the majority of kids don't. So what's the difference between the kids that do and the kids that don't? Right? And we can learn from both groups. And so that's one of the questions we're trying to ask here is, who's at greater risk and why? And it's important to note that having the deletion is neither necessary nor sufficient to predict the outcome. All right? So we know lots of folks that develop schizophrenia that don't have chromosome 22q deletion. All right? And just because you have it doesn't mean you're going to get it. You're not going to get schizophrenia just because you have the deletion. We know that. So what might, when you think about anxiety, I think about anxiety in more of the physiological effects. You need to think about a mechanism. Right? You can feel anxiety and you can have a difficulty coping with anxiety, and it can diminish your quality of life. But what are the mechanisms that may actually contribute to a physiological change long-term that modulates that risk of schizophrenia? Not causes it. We're not saying stress causes schizophrenia, but it doesn't modulate it. So how might that contribute to that risk? Okay, so as many of you know, children with 22q deletion syndrome and their parents have a lot of things to deal with, right? Parents of typically developing kids have a lot of things to deal with, but the kids with 22q have extra stuff they have to deal with, all right? And some of those day-to-day challenges are increased by exactly the kind of things that Dr. Simon was talking about. So you have certain specific issues with health, And as the child enters the school system, so some of the cognitive and social challenges become a little bit more pressing as the demands increase, all right? And it becomes more and more apparent, some of these challenges become more apparent in the context of this increased social and academic expectation. There's lots of things that we can use to measure the physiology of stress, okay? And one of the ones that we're using is cortisol. And cortisol, why are we going to measure cortisol? I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. You can measure things like heart rate, you can measure blood pressure, you can measure immunological function, you can measure lots of things. But cortisol is an interesting one because it's a metabolic hormone that is released on a regular pattern throughout the day. So it gets very high in the morning, right before as you're waking up, before you wake up, and before you get out of bed, it increases, kind of get you ready for the day, sort of rallying resources. So cortisol is a hormone that gets increases glucose availability for your body, right? So get ready to sort of get rolling, sort of ramp up the fuel, okay? And it increases in the morning, and then throughout the day, it declines in the afternoon, into the evening, very, very low, and it goes back up before you wake up. So it's this nice rhythm, looks like a wave, day after day after day. What's neat about cortisol, it's also released in acute stress, a really rapid stress, right? To get your body ready. You just wait, your pupils dilate, and blood goes to your muscles, and your heart rate goes up to increase oxygenation to your body. It's the idea of a fight or flight response, right? Whether you're going to be chased by hyenas, you're on a first date, whatever. You're going to get this excitement, right? And it rallies the body's resources. Now, in the short term, that's great. That's wonderful. But in the long term, it can have some problems. So it's like revving the engine in the red line all the time, right? You're really pushing the system, right? And we know that you see dysregulation or changes in cortisol output and that daily rhythm with people who have major depression or anxiety disorders. We see that. We see differences in kids who have early trauma, even typically developing kids have early trauma in their lives. You see changes in the way the system works. And what happens is that fight or flight, you think about the mechanism, you know, if you really got to run away from hyenas chasing you, let's not worry about digesting our dinner right now. Let's not worry about fighting that infection. Let's not worry about those things. We need to survive. Okay? We need to survive. So we put these things off. So cortisol, it does lots of things, but one of the things it does in the short term is suppress the immune system, which would be problematic for many kids with 22q deletion syndrome. We know that in very long-term chronic exposures to cortisol in animal models, that it actually causes neuronal death in certain parts of the brain, or decreased arborization, or decreased number of branches in certain neurons, okay? And may decrease neurogenesis, that's the growth of new neurons, okay? In places like the hippocampus. Okay? So we know that there are some real issues that very chronic effects have. How are we actually measuring this? This is one of the things we're measuring, not just cortisol, but I want to focus on cortisol for the purpose of this talk. So this is a mock scanner. It's a mock-up of a scanner. And one of the things that we're doing with the kids who come visit is we want to see how this very mild stressor, we don't want to say we're stressing the kids out, but if you've ever been at an MRI before, you go, wow, what's this going to be about? So it's novel. It's a little bit, this is kind of interesting. I'm meeting some new people. I'm seeing this new thing. I have to lie still in this bed and watch stuff and listen to noises. Well, that's stressful. Any novel change is quote unquote stressful. Even good things in life. You get married, it'd be stressful, right? Win the lottery, have a baby, all those things are stressful. Good things can be stressful too. So anyway, the kids go in here, and what we do is we measure their cortisol and other things as well, cortisol before and after. And what we'd expect is that kids would have a little bit of a bump in their stress response as measured by cortisol, and then it declines, right? Okay, so it should dissipate. And what do we see? So here in the white bar here are kids with 22q deletion syndrome, and here in the black bar are typically developing kids. And the cortisol output is a little higher in the kids with 22q, both before the MRI practice and after the MRI practice. And in fact, their overall cortisol levels are a little bit higher, okay? Now, we have other data that says that they are feeling a little bit anxious. And another thing we're doing is looking at cortisol levels over time at home. So we need to know what's going on in the real world. You come into a laboratory situation, it's not really a typical day, is it? Right? So what we do is we have these kits that we send home, and we measure saliva over school days and home days. And we can get an idea of what that rhythm, remember I talked about that rhythm? That natural rhythm goes up and down like this, right? So we can actually measure that and compare school days versus home days. And school days are probably going to be more stressful. Home days are probably going to be a little more comfortable, aren't they? So this is just preliminary data that we're adding to as parents send in the kits. We can add more data to this. Here's the awake challenge. This is the morning, and you see this increase in 22q kids with 22q deletion syndrome. It's higher all the way across the day than typical kids. Okay? This one's a little odd. These numbers are a little odd. We're not really sure what's going on here. It's probably the time of the day that's being collected. So maybe they're missing that first before the child gets out of bed. But again, on the school day, it's higher. And it should really go down to almost nothing in the evening. And here's the home day. You still see this increased morning court in the kids with 22q deletion syndrome, but then they get more of this normal, typical level in the evening, right, when the support network is there. So this is an ongoing study, and we can, I really want to try to get some more of you involved in this study. It's really, really important work. But what are some of the implications? You're going to hear more about this, but I'm just going to say very briefly. Anxiety and coping skills we can treat and train. Right? We can improve quality of life very early, and we can do it along the whole continuum of life. Doesn't matter if you're a little kid or you're a teenager. All right? And potentially, this is the first step. We have to actually measure, see whether there is a problem. We don't know. We say maybe there's a problem. This is literally the first step. But if we do find that there is a difference that's robust and survives all of our different tests, methodological tests that we put on our theory, potentially we could actually develop tailored interventions to bump that developmental trajectory in a more positive direction. Right? And also, as I mentioned before, we may learn what factors are actually protective against stress. So if stress is a moderating factor for risk of psychosis later in life, we can actually see, well, what is it that really works? What are the factors that contribute to coping that really help? And can we actually learn from the kids who are doing really well and help the kids who are having a little more trouble? Now, I just want to add this caveat because I don't want everybody going home and going, wow, stress. We can't have stress in the house. We can't have stress. And, everybody's going to be walking on eggshells all the time. This is absolutely important to get this point across. Stress is a good thing, like pain. People don't like pain. But if you didn't feel pain at all, you'd never take your hand off the stove, right? So it's really important to have these things. So anxiety and stress actually can motivate behavior. If I was a little bit anxious, why would I pay my Visa bill? Well, don't bother, right? Right? These feelings reduce risk behavior. This is very important. Risk behavior later on in adolescence is very, very important. If there's something you're going to have to worry about, potentially worry about. Increased but necessary, but not always pleasant behavior, right? Eat your broccolis. And in a nutshell, too little is not good and too much is not good. So there's an optimal balance, okay? So I just want to get this point across here, a little advertisement. So this is an ongoing and very, 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 very important. I can't tell you how important. So the National Institutes of Health has given us a large amount of money to actually answer these questions. For the first time, no one's ever asked about stress, and specifically stress and anxiety, and the physiological effects of stress and anxiety in kids with 22q deletion syndrome. It's absolutely critical work. If we don't deliver, they pull the funding. Okay? So I really, really hope that we can get you guys excited about participating in this work. All right? And to get in touch with me, and also especially use the cable email that Dr. Simon showed at the beginning of the talk. But you can also email me directly, right? Or you can call me if you have other questions. We have a lot of people contributing to this, and I say thank you, but mostly, absolutely from the heart, thank you to you for participating and for being here today.